So let's put together several little stories and see what comes up for us in our endeavor to bring this circle around, to create an aperture for us to move on. And first, everyone knows that old story about the samurai swordsman who, coming off the battlefield, yet another battlefield, was walking along the road, rather weary and bloodied from his encounters, when he meets an old monk on the road. And he stops the old monk and confronts him and stands up tall and arrogantly in front of him and says, "Old monk, I'm a famous samurai swordsman. Tell me, is there a heaven and an earth?" And with that, the old monk looks at the tall samurai swordsman and said, "You, a samurai swordsman? Look at you, you bedraggled wreck. I bet your sword wouldn't even cut through a piece of tofu." But with that, the eyes of the samurai swordsman filled with blood, and he took out his sword and he put it at the throat of the old monk. And the old monk looked at him fearlessly and said, "That's hell." With that, the samurai swordsman looked into the eyes of the old monk and could see not only their fearlessness, but their gentleness. And tears welled up in his eyes. He fell down on his knees in front of the old monk, recognizing that this old man was willing to die for truth. And very gently, the old man lifted him to his feet and said, "And that's heaven." And then there's a second story about another samurai swordsman. In fact, he was Lord. He was called Lord Yagyu. But not only was he a great swordsman, he was also a practitioner and an adherent of Zen Buddhism. But he'd been called to the battlefield, and somewhat severely wounded and bloodied after the battle, he rode directly to the monastery where his master Tadayashi was the abbot. And when he entered the monastery, the master Tadayashi was in the middle of a tea ceremony. So he offered Lord Yagyu a cup of tea. And he said to Lord Yagyu, "How does it stand with you?" And with that, Lord Yagyu dropped his cup and saucer to the ground and stomped on them and said, "Heaven and earth are shattered." So Master Tadayashi said to Lord Yagyu, "When heaven and earth are shattered, how does it stand with you?" And with that, Lord Yagyu crossed his arms across his chest and bowed before the Master Tadayashi. But just as he was bowing, Master Tadayashi took his hand and slapped him just where Lord Yagyu had an open wound. And Lord Yagyu recoiled in pain. And Master Tadayashi said, "Heaven and earth are not yet completely shattered." And with that, they could hear in the distance the sound of the trumpets calling all of the samurais to the battlefield. So Lord Yagyu mounted his horse once again and rode off. But after this battle, now severely wounded, he rode back to Master Tadayashi's monastery. And when he entered, Master Tadayashi said, "When heaven and earth are completely shattered, how does it stand with you?" And with that, Lord Yagyu leant on his sword and passed away. The third story is about a man called Simon. Now Simon had been born to Jewish parents, but his parents had been killed in one of those times when the Jews were being slaughtered. And he was taken off, and he was trained to become a gladiator in the Roman army. Now Simon was a man of gigantic stature. He was feared on the battlefield for his valor. But there was a time when Simon was again called to conquest. But as he was going to join this battle, he had to cross a very narrow bridge. And as he was crossing that bridge in his full regalia, his armor, his helmet, his sword at his side, he encountered an old rabbi, Rabbi Nachman. Now Rabbi Nachman was very small in stature, with a very gentle demeanor. So when these two met in the middle of the bridge, Simon demanded that the rabbi make way for him. Didn't he know that he was on his way to fight a battle for the Roman emperor? But Rabbi Nachman stood his ground. Neither would cede the space. And then Simon, getting angry, took out his sword and demanded that Rabbi Nachman give him his way. But without speaking a word, Rabbi Nachman stood his ground. And then Simon looked into the eyes of the old rabbi, and he saw something that he had never seen before in any of his adversaries. This was an absence of fear. This he'd never met before, and somehow he could not take his eyes from the eyes of this old man. And as he did, something moved within him. So he was able to see that this old man was not only fearless, but that he knew his relationship with God and his place in the scheme of life. And with that, tears began to fall from the eyes of Simon. And Rabbi Nachman looked at Simon and said, "Why don't you join me? I can see in your heart that there's longing for peace and sukha." And Simon replied, "But I'm a gladiator. There is only the battle for Rome," coining the phrase of that which had been programmed in him from an early age. But their gaze was still fixed on one another. And Rabbi Nachman said, "The Roman Empire is finite and will crumble, as are all things that come and go. But there is something that is constant, unchanging, and eternal." With that, Simon threw his sword in the river, took off his armor, and joined Rabbi Nachman. He himself became a great and revered rabbi. When we put these three simple stories together, what do they remind you of in yourself? What is it that arises when we put these three simple stories together? How do they help to join a circle? Close a link that allows an aperture for us to begin a new phase of endeavor. The samurai, realizing heaven and earth, Lord Yakyu shattering, having shattered heaven and earth. And Simon, recognizing permanency, something that doesn't change. What is it about these stories for us? Uh-huh.
Well, for me, if I have any illusions, they're definitely shattered.
All right.
In some way or form.
All right. Hasn't that been the way all along? Shattering of one illusion after another, after another.
Yeah, when I realised I had an inner conflict that we had to get out.
That's right.
Find what causes it.
All right.
I think the soul is the battle within ourselves.
Ourselves. Yeah. Is it possible to find that permanency without the shattering?
No, because the mind's living in a world of impermanence.
Uh-huh. Can we find that permanency when heaven and earth are apart? How are they shattered in us?
Forgotten.
Right. Thank you.